Hey everybody, this is David Skarica. So today we're going to get back to our series on great trades by great investors. And today we're going to look at Jim Dines when he became he called himself the original internet bug. So I'll show you this book that he wrote, which is one of my favorite investment books of all time. And what Jim used to talk about, et cetera, et cetera. So I always liked Jim. I didn't really know who he was. I knew like Doug. So I got started quite young, just to give you a little background. Like I started reading about investing. Actually, now that I'm on Amazon looking at Jim's books, we could also look at this. So I read this book. Actually, I'm sorry. 1985. Sorry. By Edward Figge, and it was like written, I probably was like 16, it was like 93 or 94 I read it. And I thought it was fascinating, and was about, the government had too much debt. What's funny is the government projected debt has gone up faster than this guy predicted, but because he didn't anticipate interest rates going to like zero over that nearly 30-year period. Which is common sense, right? You wouldn't think the debt would go from like 3-4 trillion to 30 trillion and rates would go down. Like common sense would dictate that rates would start going higher if that was the case. But anyhow, this book really stirred my imagination. There was another book by James Dale Davidson. It wasn't The Great Reckoning. It was something about like decline and fall of the welfare state. And it was just like a little mini book that was like a little ad book he used for his newsletter. So basically that kind of stirred it. And of course, because I'm reading these kind of books, I got interested in gold and precious metals and how to hedge against kind of calamity and the whatnot. So maybe in the long run, that maybe hurt me because, I got more interested in, I've always been kind of conservative because of that, and not someone who is really aggressive. And so I would have been probably better off participating in a lot of these bubbles, right? Which I haven't done. I've still done pretty well, but and the whatnot. So anyhow, so this book, this is a great book, Mass Psychology. He quickly talks about the internet in it. And he talks about like how you look at your own personal psychology, the mass psychology of crowds and markets and bubbles and the whatnot. So it's just a great book. It's very funny too. He wasn't a funny guy. So when I first saw him, like I said, I knew Doug Casey and kind of all the people that were known in the gold bug world. This guy gets up and he's like Don Rickles or Rodney Dangerfield on stage, like just hilarious. He always had a couple like attractive girls at his booth, being a Robert Palmer fan. That's why I originally named my newsletter Addicted to Profits. Obviously that's one of my favorite songs and videos where Robert Palmer's got the girl models in the background as the band, et cetera, et cetera. So, so I'm just sipping on a coffee. So this is always one of my favorite books. I highly recommend it. You can buy there's tons of them used online for like $2. I don't think they ever made a Kindle out of this, but it's definitely worth the read. And it's more of like something to look at yourself, look at your own psychology. It's actually more of like almost a self-reflection book than mass psychology, than actually investing. But he does mention the internet. So at the time, he just basically said the internet was going to be the biggest thing ever. He started writing this in kind of the mid to late 90s. That book, I think, was published in 95 or 96. But like he really started talking about, I think about 97, 98. And so he had what was called the 4 horsemen of the internet. Now, he recommended a whole bunch of companies. I remember MediConsult was one he recommended that went under. The Globe. He got stopped out in some of these. Some things just went to zero. But he had his 4 main ones were, he called them the 4 horsemen of the internet. And they were Amazon.com. They were Yahoo, they were CMGI, and they were AOL. Now, the only one that still trades, believe it or not, is Amazon. Now, if you had bought all of these at his original price in the late 90s, you would have done good. I remember he was in Amazon now, adjusted for all the splits it's had, probably at the equivalent of like 50 or 60 cents, right? Back in like 97, 98, right? So let's say argument say he was in at 50 cents. That would be like, 300 times on your money. The other ones I have the charts of it because they're private. So this is an AOL chart, and you can see AOL had a kind of secondary run. You can see what it did, in the late 90s, went up like huge. So this is Yahoo. Yahoo went up huge. What happened with Yahoo was that Yahoo had a holding in Alibaba. That holding actually became worth more than the rest of the company. So that's why, after this long base, after the bubble blow off, it had this secondary run and then essentially went private. Because, it made no sense for it to be a public company anymore, because first of all, when they're a private company, they can sell their Baba stake off whenever they want without having to report it. And then secondly, again, their stock was basically becoming a holding stock for Alibaba. So it wasn't even, trading on its own fundamentals. But again, if you had bought Dines and granted, Dines did not take his own advice. He sold out of many of these stocks in the early 2000s. He was stopped out on a bunch of them. Like, he did not own Amazon. He just died last year in 2022. He did not own Amazon. Rest in peace, Jim. He did not own Amazon to the day he died. And again, that's the problem with writing an investment newsletter. And that's why I'm trying to get out of it into what I'm doing now. Because when you write a newsletter and you hold a stock that goes up like this, or what Amazon did too, you'll really see it if we take the log scale off Amazon. Well, you don't see this here, but when you write we'll look at Amazon in the early 2000s so you can see it. But when you write a stock up from, Amazon goes up tenfold and then gives back all the gains, people are like, what the hell's wrong with you? Why didn't you sell? You stink. You're a bum. So then that's really hard. I mean, you're just like, no, this is a long-term thing. We're looking at 20 years. People, in my humble opinion, other than kind of like my lifetime subscribers, people don't buy an investment newsletter and have a 20-year outlook. They buy an investment newsletter and they have a 2-year outlook or a 2-month outlook. I can't tell you how many people I had, sign up for the newsletter, just get a refund after 1 month because they just got my trading positions and the whatnot. So that's why I prefer what I'm doing now. I consider the Patreon memberships more like a donation, and the lifetime memberships are people that have memberships are people that have this long-term view towards investing, right? So yeah, so that's kind of where I go to right now in the markets and what I'm doing. So yeah, so that's kind of what happened with Dine. So if we go and look at sorry, I'm just trying to get this. Oh, 1 second, I got to do this again. Sorry. I keep having my because during the weekend I use my projector a lot. But the projector blows up the screen a bit. So anyway, I took that off. So you can see Yahoo and then Yahoo. So again, you would have been up a lot if you eventually buy it. Yeah, this is AOL. Verizon, took them over. Same thing. AOL had a huge run, took over Time Warner, which was ridiculous because of course AOL is way bigger in Time Warner, and you can see that AOL as of 2015 had 620 million in revenue. So imagine them taking over Time Warner in $160 billion deal when, basically 15 years later, or 10 years, 15 years later, they only had, 625 in revenue for that quarter. So that's 2.4 billion. But, imagine that. $160 billion deal on a company that over 10 years later would have 2.4 billion roughly in revenue over the course of a year, and they got taken over for 4.4 billion. So, but you can see again, if you had held, you've done quite well. You would have bought a few dollars in the late 90s and still done quite well. But again, no one really does that. And a lot of Dine subscribers, the problem is too, would have been buying in here when the bubble was, when he was hot. Like, he was the biggest newsletter writer probably in the world from 99 to 2000. And we'll talk about more of his other trades, but this guy had a really unique, he got into 3D printing. He got into marijuana stocks. He was one of the original gold bulls back in the 60s. He had this great knack for finding. And this is like what I'm saying, where I've always kind of been conservative, being someone who's interested in gold. I've always kind of been these markets are always bubble. So that's why I'm now much more open to new technologies. And again, you talk about age and learning from your mistakes. When you read Dine's Mass Psychology or his writings in the 90s or 2000s, it's way better than his writings from the 60s. And in 2000, well, he died, he was 90. So that's roughly 20 years ago. he was in his late 60s, you know, even he got big in the early 70s when gold began to move. You know, he was in his, you know, like late 30s, early 40s. He wasn't much younger than me, and that he just started to become known. So it just shows you, like, sometimes I beat up on myself for making the mistakes that I've made, but I'm like 46, and in the investment world, like in the sports world, 46 is ancient. You know, Tom Brady retired last year and he was 45. He's the same age as me, Tom Brady. He was born in 77. And, you know, that was considered like, you know, ancient for a quarterback in the NFL. But if you go look at Templeton, like I said, Buffett, Soros, Dines, all of these guys, it's about their 40s, 50s when they really start making money. So anyhow, that's basically it. And then, so the last of this fourth horseman was CMGI. And it just shows you, again, with investing in CMGI, basically, it was kind of an incubator stock. It owned these positions and all these .coms. So of course, it was like heavily leveraged, and then it completely collapsed. And supposedly the CEO, I remember, if you ever read, there's an excellent book by the guys who ran the globe.com. They talked about it, and they said, because the CMGI guy had an investment in them, and they said that he was like very like emotionally like unstable and stuff. So I can't say that for a fact. I had no clue, but anyhow, but what's interesting is, again, we look at what's gone on, and Amazon's really the only one of those stocks that has worked out longer term. Now, ultimately, you know, Google has done well. Google, you know, came public, but it just shows you too, first of all, when you're early on in a boom, how many stocks really survive? You know, AOL and Yahoo are now been taken over and gone private. You know, CMGI basically went under. So one of these worked. And then remember, he had dozens of other like pets.com and all these smaller positions, I remember too, that a lot of them, again, he got stopped out of. Some he sold at a loss, et cetera, et cetera. But like, if you had owned like a basket of 10 or 20 of these things, if you had just owned Amazon, you would have done fine, you know, even with the other, you know, 10 or 12 not working out. And that which makes this call kind of interesting. But anyhow, it was just amazing. Like, we all knew the internet was going to become a huge factor in business life, you know, back in the mid 90s. I remember I got a PC when just after I graduated from high school. I guess you could call it a graduation present. It was like 96. And basically the choice I had, because, you know, my dad was going to, you know, even though my dad had money, he didn't want to splurge too huge, was, do you want a CD-ROM, you know, so you can play video games? I've never really been, other than having my Atari and a Nintendo, I was never been big into video games. And I never had to get like the new PlayStation or whatever. So you play video games on the CD-ROM, you know, on your computer, or listen to music or whatnot, or get the internet connection, you know, and then the computer would just be used for kind of word processing, writing stuff. And I was like, I want the damn internet. And of course it ended up, you know, I still remember the dial-up days and all of that stuff, but that was huge for me, you know, like, you know, that's how I got to start my newsletter when I was young in the late 90s, because I had a small online, you know, presence, et cetera, et cetera. You know, I remember the first newsletters I did in 1998 when I was like 21. They were still all print, and then I moved to the internet within 6 months. You know, and I still remember, like, you know, whatever, I had 50 subscribers, and I remember, you know, when I got those 50 subscribers, because a couple guys who liked me, older guys, I was so excited. I ran to whatever, paid my $1 per thing to ship all that off. And yeah, I think most of my subscriptions by then were I was taking by check. So it's kind of funny thinking about your early days in the market, you know. So anyhow, James Dines, internet guru, you know, etc. Now, one thing that's interesting about Dines, we'll talk about this when we talk about his other calls in the future. He had something in his book called, he had these Dineisms, which is kind of like his philosophies on life and investing. He had something called Die Bubble, which is people inside the bubble are invisible to the bubble. So all these crypto people, they hold through, like, you know, these boom and busts have been in crypto because they think this crypto is just always going to go up. You know, I did that in junior mining stocks in the mid 90s. So he was guilty of that because he would always call these booms, you know, and he called the booms better than anyone I've ever seen, but he barely ever got out before the bust. So that, you know, that was kind of funny. That I always thought about him, that that was one of his own principles that he didn't really follow himself, that he was guilty of being kind of trapped in his own bubbles. But anyhow, it was a great call. We look at all these stocks, AOL, even if you had bought in the late 90s, even though they never went back to their 2000 high, AOL and Yahoo would have been great, booms. Of course, we got Google, and Google has done fantastically since coming public. So all of these things, I don't know if Dines ever got into Apple. I don't think he did, because Apple was not really an internet play back in the late 90s. But, we know about what a lot of these tech stocks have done, et cetera. Microsoft benefited greatly from the internet because now cloud computing and obviously, more PC sales, because like myself, people were getting computers to be on the internet. So Microsoft really benefited from that too. Even though eventually it failed, BlackBerry was a huge boom stock. Why? Because when you could put in get data over the cell phone network, again using the internet, and BlackBerry was more basic at the time, just more for business and emails. And BlackBerries were all about using as little data as possible. And by the way, that's another series I'm going to do as well. I'm going to do like the story of stocks, I'm going to call it. And we're going to look at the history of these stocks and boom bust. There's a great movie on BlackBerry, by the way. You can buy it right off YouTube, which I highly recommend, or rent it off YouTube. It's actually, I think it was done by the CBC, which I'm not a huge fan of the CBC, but it is a great movie on kind of the boom and bust of BlackBerry. And but another stock that kind of the internet really created. And classic example though, like technology is a tough business, man, because okay, for every Amazon, there's a whole bunch of BlackBerries who are these huge boom stocks that bust and never come back. Nokia, Ericsson, they're all the same way as well. But anyhow, Jim Dines, great call of the internet's bubble or boom. If anyone who bought Dines, I'm sure there's got to be a handful of subscribers who bought Amazon and never sold and have done very, very well. So everybody take care, and I hope you really enjoyed this.